I'm going to show you guys how to replace the front struts, front wheel bearings, and rear shocks on this 2017 Chevy Volt. It's going to be the same process for a couple of Chevy's other sedans and small cars like the Cruze, and I think the older Volts are pretty similar. I'll put part numbers in the description. The wheel bearings are easy to get. You can pretty much buy them anywhere, like Rock Auto or an auto parts store. You can get the rear shock absorbers a few places online, but the front struts are unavailable pretty much everywhere. As of this time right now, January 2025, no stores carry the front struts, and you can't get them anywhere online except a Chevy dealer. You can't get them from Rock Auto or anything like that. I don't know if that's because of the weight differences in the Chevy Volt compared to the Cruze or what, but I will put the part numbers below and where you can get those. You can start this job on the top or the bottom. I'll just go ahead and show you from the top. The first thing we're going to have to do is actually remove the wiper arms as well as the cowl pieces. So you need to pop these little caps off here, and if I remember, they're 15 on the Chevy Cruze, so this should be the same. And then we have these two corner pieces, one there and the same over there. These are just going to pull outward. You can see an example of what the clip looks like for these right there. And once those are out, then we have to remove this entire cowl section to be able to get to the strut hardware here up on top. So you're going to want to use a trim tool to pop the center sections of these little buttons up. Then you can pull the bodies out. So inside the wheel well of the Volt is really pretty much the same thing as every vehicle before it. So it should look familiar if you work on cars sort of often. You have your two pinch bolts here from the strut to the knuckle. You're going to have to remove the hardware for the sway bar. This one's a little bit interesting. It's an 18 mil here, which Chevy likes to use, but then this is going to be a 9 millimeter. I don't have any 9 millimeters. I usually throw them in the trash, so I'll be using an 11/32. You're going to need to also remove this sensor wire right here. Just pull up on it and it'll come right out. If you're just doing the strut, you can pretty much stop there. If you're doing the wheel bearing, you are going to need to have a 32 mil socket for the axle nut, or you can use 1 1/4 inches. 1 1/4 inches is going to be kind of tight. You're also going to want to make sure you have a 21 millimeter to remove the brake caliper bolts. There's one here and then one on the bottom. You can go about it two different ways. This one is a little more difficult to do. You don't have a lot of room to work on the bottom one. Let me see if I can show you that up here. So the brake line is right here. And what happens is the caliper bolt is right behind it. So you can't get a deep socket on it. You could either use a short socket and an extension to get your ratchet way over here, or you could use a ratcheting wrench in a 21 mil. You're not going to be able to fit a 13/16 on there. So that's one of the tools that you may have to go buy if you don't have one. Okay, go ahead and grab a small flathead screwdriver, and we're going to use that to pop the caps off the wiper arms, as well as pop up the tops of all these little clips right here. So different people will want to mark the wiper arms in different ways. You can get a marker, and you can either mark the stud and the arm, or you can also mark the windshield itself with a piece of tape or something like that, or a dry erase marker. Just don't take the nut in account when you're trying to mark something, because that's obviously going to spin. Removing the wiper arms can be pretty difficult, actually, and that's because the shafts here are both splined and tapered. So once you remove this nut, you're going to have to just be careful, but wiggle this thing in all directions by pushing this arm down, up, and trying to slant it side to side. You want to definitely avoid putting anything back behind here and prying on it, because the windshield goes down pretty far down here and you can crack it really easily. So just be patient on this part right here and wiggle the arm up and down and kind of cant it side to side. I'll try to show you that in the video, but it may be kind of hard. There we go. So see, it broke loose. Now I'll kind of relieve the tension on the arm. Then I can pull the thing out. As far as removing these plastic pieces, you're just going to push this one clip in from the side, and then you should be able to pull it up this way. You may want to use a pry tool. You can use a plastic one if you're afraid of scratching it, and then just kind of wiggle it out of its place. It goes up underneath the windshield. Just so you know, it can be difficult if you're Rubber has a lot of sun damage like mine does, so just be careful with it. Just remove that off of both sides. Okay, once you have those side pieces off, you're gonna start with these little clips right here. If you turn the base, you'll see there's one entry point on each one of these clips that you can slide a small flathead screwdriver into. And what you wanna do is, I don't have a flathead screwdriver with me, but you wanna pop the center section up, and that's going to release the clip. So once the center section is popped up like that, then you can pull up on the whole clip. You don't wanna remove the center section completely from the base. You wanna leave it like this. I mean, if you remove it, it's not that big of a deal, but it makes it a lot easier if it's in one piece instead. So go ahead and remove all of these. Once you have all your little push pins removed, now we can go ahead and pull off the cowl. So there are gonna be these foam pieces, these little gap fillers on either side. Be careful not to rip them. They are just kind of stuffed into the pocket down here. So you'll just turn this up and out. This piece of foam is going to be attached on the Chevy Volt, whereas on the Chevy Cruze, it's actually like slid into this little gap right here. So these are different. Then we'll just pull up right here on the corner to release that first tab. Now this whole section is pretty much free. Okay, same thing over here. We're just gonna move this foam up and out of the way. Make sure you don't rip it, leave it attached, and then pull up to release that clip. Then once both sides are released, we'll pull forward. Once it clears the wiper arm stud, then we can move this assembly out of the way. And really, you can just kind of leave it right here. You don't actually have to remove this from the car. If I remember on the Chevy Cruze, this is all one piece, whereas on the Volt here, it's actually two pieces. Okay, so next up we have the hardware slots or covers for the struts, and they're gonna be under these little holes right here. If you're not using power tools, which I highly recommend, you would want to break this nut loose with the wheel on the ground, because there's no way you're gonna be able to get it loose once you have the vehicle jacked up. I'm using a power tool, an impact, which I highly, highly recommend, so we're not gonna have to worry about that. And like I said, this is gonna be a 32 mil. 1 1/4 will also fit. I like to go ahead and remove the axle nut before I start anything else. That way we can put a little bit of penetrating fluid in here on the splines. Don't go crazy with it. You can use WD-40 if you want, but this Freol is really my favorite. So we'll let that stuff soak in there, because a lot of times the CV axle likes to get seized up in the wheel bearing. And while that's soaking, we can work on the other stuff. So the next thing is gonna be removing the brake caliper, and you want to do this before you do anything else. The reason we want to do this first is because both of the brake caliper bolts are extremely tight and they have Loctite on them. These are going to be a little bit difficult to video, but I wanted to show you the bottom one, and why this one's a little bit harder. It's because you have this brake line coming out right here, so it's going to interfere with using a deep socket and a ratchet unless you're willing to bend your brake line, which I don't recommend. So you're going to want either a short 21 mil 1/2 inch drive and an extension, or some type of ratcheting wrench. You can use a 21. Okay, I know the lining isn't the best, but the top one is also kind of tricky because you have this bolt right here for the strut. Now, if you want to, you can go ahead and remove this bottom bolt, and then you can use a deep socket, but you're probably already gonna have bought a short 21, and a short 21 socket will work just fine because it'll end before this bolt, and then you can use an extension to get past it. Alternatively, you could go back to your 21 mil wrench if that's what you used on the bottom. Okay, obviously you're going to want to support your caliper just like every other vehicle. I happen to be working pretty close to the ground, so I can actually just set it down here, but you'll probably want to get some baling wire or a bungee cord or something like that to hold it up so you're not stressing the brake line. Next up, we're going to remove this sensor wire retainer, and all you have to do is just pull up on it. So this right here is what we're going to do, and I'm just going to pull up right there, so that way it's got some slack to wiggle around. Now we've got to remove the nuts on both sides These are going to be an 18 millimeter. And on the left side or the front here, they are going to be splined and pressed into the knuckle itself. So you're going to have to hammer them to remove them. Go ahead and loosen each one of these nuts and then thread it back on a few threads. I've got both of those nuts loosened up, but then threaded back on. Next, we want to go ahead and remove the rotor. This is going to be a T27 Torx. If you're not replacing your rotor, just be careful with it. Don't want to damage it. If you're working on a Chevy Volt, I bet your rotors are probably going to be good because this vehicle uses regen braking. All right, now we can go ahead and mess with our CV shaft a little bit. Just give it a few light taps to see if it's loose. And if not, you may want to put the nut back on and use a wood spacer or something like that. And then you can hammer on it to loosen it up. We'll see if ours is loose. Oh yeah, that thing moved really easily, so we're not gonna have to worry. Sometimes these things will be seized up, so you can see why I like to spray some penetrant on them before you even start anything else in here. Now that that's loose, and we know we're not gonna have any issues with having to beat it out, now we can remove these bolts completely. You wanna leave them in, or I guess you could leave them completely tight until you know that your CV shaft works, because if you have to go beating on this, you need a sturdy background so you can transmit all that force into the CV axle. If you already removed these strut mount bolts, then this is gonna be a pain in the butt to get out because the whole thing's gonna be wiggling around. Now, obviously, if you're not doing the wheel bearing, forget all this stuff I just said and crack on with this bit with removing the strut. Now that I've got these loose and threaded back on, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna bang on them from this side right here until the splined bit starts to come out. Okay, so there's the first one. Hopefully you can see in there, I don't know if the camera will focus on that or not, but that section in there is actually splined. So once it bottoms out, go ahead and loosen that nut up and see if you can pull it out. Sometimes you'll have to loosen it a few threads and then give it a few more taps. There we go. So now this bolt is completely loose. We can pull it out and you can see the knurling on there that keeps this thing tight. So go ahead and move your lower one. I'm going to do that off camera. Okay, we're going to continue ahead if you're just doing the strut, and then we'll get back to the wheel bearing here in a minute. Next up, you're going to need a deep 18. You can go ahead and break this loose with a heavy impact. Almost always it will start to spin about halfway through, and you don't want to sit there and spin this shaft in the joint because that will accelerate its wear. And you are going to have your impact tightening. Okay, there we go. Now we can remove the sway bar link. Okay, up here on top is where we're going to remove these 3 bolts that we exposed in the beginning. They're all going to be 13 millimeter. All right, I'm going to remove this last stud right here, and our strut should drop. All right, there we go. You can use a magnet or something like that to retrieve your hardware from the top. Now we can kind of guide this thing out. We'll drop it down in between the tie rod, and the whole strut assembly will come out. Okay, so there's our strut right there, and you can see that one stud that I was talking about. Now, the factory manual and all data says that you need to remove this stud and replace it with a bolt. I'll leave that up to you guys on what you think you should do. Okay, now onto the wheel bearing, and you'll be able to see pretty quickly why I like to do these jobs at the same time. We have all this room to work inside here now. It's gonna be much easier to get an impact back here to these bolts that hold the wheel bearing in. So go ahead and push the axle. I just use my thumb there. Push it through the front. Being mindful there is going to be a washer that's going to pop out. As you can see, look at that. Mine's broken, so maybe I can see if I can get a new one. But the washer is going to go right on here if yours comes out and you're not sure where it's supposed to go. Go ahead and pull your axle completely out, set it to the side. Be mindful of your wire once again. And then we can get an impact in here. And now we can see the bolts that hold the wheel bearing in. So there's one right there, there's one there, And there's one right there. This will be kind of a difficult thing for me to video because the space is really cramped. All you gotta do is jam your impact in there, and then you can remove those. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and bust all these out here. I'm gonna be using a short 18 on my 1/2 inch impact. Whew, there we go. A lot of these type of wheel bearings are going to be a really tight fit inside here, in my experience. The ones on the Volt or Cruise or whatever, actually a lot of these newer Chevy vehicles come out pretty easily. All right, so let's take a look at our wheel hub or wheel bearing, whatever you want to call it. You can see we've got quite a bit of crud, and a lot of the crud is really shiny. So the passenger side was a lot worse, and I thought I could kind of maybe hear a grinding sound. So you can see why we're replacing these together, not only because it's easier to get to this with the strut out of the way, but because about 100,000 miles or so is typically how long these things last. Okay, now you'll want to take the time to go ahead and clean out this hole in the knuckle right here. Make sure it's all nice, and so your bearing will go, so your new bearing will go in and seat well. Once that's all clean, we can go ahead and get the new wheel bearing out. I recommend you go with a quality brand, something like Timken or SKF. You could also go with Moog, but I prefer SKF over Moog these days. The wheel bearing does not go in a specific direction, so you can just mount it in any way that you want. Just make sure that you have your brake dust cover ready to go. You don't want to skip this step on accident. So I'll just slide everything back in here, and then I'll use one of the bolts to hold everything in place so I can line up the others. I have a bad habit of using an impact to torque a lot of things. I just know the torque settings of my Milwaukee M18, and I'll impact these down on setting number 2. But I will put the actual torque specs in the description below. It'll be the torque specs for pretty much everything on this entire job. But now you're just going to tighten these up, and if all you're doing is the wheel bearing, then you're pretty much done. You can put it back together. But once we get this back together, I'll show you installing the front struts and getting them ready. Now that we've got our new wheel bearings in, it's time to go ahead and disassemble and reassemble our struts. Now this can seem like a pretty daunting task if you haven't done it before, and there's a lot of kind of mystery and danger associated with replacing struts. It really isn't bad if you use the correct tools and you're smart about it. So I'll put a link in the description to the strut compressors that I recommend. There are a lot of garbage ones out there that just make the job even more difficult. This is the kind that you want to get. Here's our old strut assembly, and here are the part numbers for the new ones. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, and if the aftermarket has started making these or not, you'll be in luck because the new part number and the old part number are gonna match. So you can't really mistake them. This is gonna be the driver's side right here, and this part number on the body matches the box over there. If you're worried that you might not get it back together correctly, what you can do is go ahead and label everything. So you can put a D on the strut mount, you can put a D on the spring, whatever you want to do. It is important that you get it in the correct orientation, however. So go ahead and take note of where the strut mount is oriented in relation to your strut body. So for example, we can go ahead and say that this stud right here, which is the only stud on the strut mount, is perfectly in line with the left side ear. You can pick whatever reference points or reference pieces of the strut that you want, but for me, that's going to be the easiest. I did forget to order one thing, which is a set of bellows for both struts. So unfortunately, mine are going to be exposed, and I probably won't ever dig back in here to mess with it again. I'll try to find those part numbers and put them for you guys. You're going to need a T50 Torx, and it's going to need to be on a ratchet or similar. You can use a 90-degree Allen key sized thing if you want, and then a 13/16 or 21 mil. So the point of that is when we go to tighten this thing, and loosen it, we're gonna have to use it there. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in a vise. You're more than welcome to do it on the floor, but for videoing and stuff like that, it's gonna be easier for me to show you this way. All right, let's go ahead and get this thing set up. I would not recommend using a vise, to be honest, because if you over crimp this thing, that's gonna be really bad. You're gonna cause some issues, but for sake of the video, that's gonna be easiest for me right now. So I'm gonna take the proper precautions there. We are gonna be moving over the strut mount, the isolator bushing or jounce bumper, bump stop, whatever you wanna call it, the spring, and then the isolator here on the bottom. So go ahead and get your spring compressors set up evenly on both sides. It's a good idea to grease these tools whenever you use them. These are really nice because not only do they compress the spring, but you can also control your preset here. All right, so we'll just get these started evenly, and then before we start cranking on them too hard, I'm gonna go ahead and loosen this top nut just a little bit. This is gonna be also a 13/16 or 21. Don't go crazy with it. I don't even know that I would recommend that most people do this, but for breaking the torque, it's easier to do it right now than later. All right, next up, we'll go ahead and take our 3/4 and we'll start compressing down our spring. You'll want to compress both sides as evenly as possible, just kind of compressing one and then doing the other back and forth. And you want to keep your hands clear of all this area, really. Okay, so every now and then, once you've done a few compressions, go ahead and see if you can move the spring and the assembly up and down. As soon as you can move the assembly up and down, then you've done enough. Okay, so I'll do just a hair more and we should be done. All right, usually this top bolt will zip off. You normally don't have to get the ratchet and the Torx out. But let's take a look and see if it does. Looks like it's spinning. I'm just gonna hold the main nut with the 13/16 to the 21, and then we'll turn this one inside here. Okay, there we go. All right, now that everything is loose, go ahead and double check, see the orientation of everything, make sure it's where you want it. And we will remove all of this crap right here. And then we'll just have to remove the isolator down here at the bottom. So just peel that up. It should only go on one way on your new strut. All right, here we have our brand new driver side strut. Exact same part number, pretty much everything matches. So we can set it right here and move everything over accordingly. We're gonna leave that there because it's no good to us, but we need to move this. Just set it in place, it'll line up exactly the same. And then we can take this assembly here and drop it over the top. You need to retain all of the hardware from this job because the new struts are not gonna come with anything. So just make sure you line your spring up on the bottom. It's gonna line up in the isolator in a certain way. Then we can start the nut here on top and go ahead and get this pretty tight. Oh, you know what? I forgot the bump stop. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, now we can start getting this thing together. Make sure our spring is lined up in there. And your spring may not sit fully seated down in the bottom until you start loosening some of the tension. So don't worry, just keep an eye on it as you're loosening the tension. Make sure that it sits where it's supposed to down in the bottom. At first you can turn the shaft, and then towards the end we're gonna turn the nut when we get to our final torque. Before you release the tension, go ahead and line up the strut mount as close to where it was before you started. So my reference point was this stud was in line with the left side ear. Okay, I'm just double checking my spring alignment on the bottom and it looks good. All right, so that's going to do it for disassembling and reassembling the struts. Really not a difficult job at all, as you can see, as long as you have the right tools. It's when you're trying to do this thing and use the incorrect tools that it can be a pain in the butt and dangerous. So installing the strut on either side is really pretty straightforward. It's going to be the reverse of pulling it out. Just make sure whenever you go to install it that you have everything aligned just like you took it out. Remember that this stud was on the outboard slash front side, and then our two bolts were at the back. So you want to make sure that this obviously is pointing outward, and you're just going to fish it up through this hole. Get one of your bolts started, that's the easiest. Then you can put the other ones in. And if you want, you can even leave them a little bit loose until you get your two pinch bolts started. So I'm going to feed this sucker up in there, and we'll get this strut attached. All right, so when this thing came out, we took it out from kind of the side over here. So I'm going to feed the bottom of the strut back in. It's going to go between the CV axle and the tie rod. All right, so I got the strut started with the stud first, and then I put that nut on there. I guess I was being a little too over critical with how it aligns because I forgot there's a locator pin, so that kind of makes it easy. I don't know if you can quite tell, but these two other holes are lined up so I can put the bolts in. All right, I don't really have a good camera situation here in the garage, unfortunately, so you're just gonna have to put this together pretty much the same exact way you took it out. So here we have our sway bar mount. It's gonna go in that hole right there. We've got our ABS sensor wire, which is gonna go back in its little holder. We're gonna install our two pinch bolts. And remember, they come in from the front and go this way with those two nuts on the back. Then all we have to do is put our brake caliper and our rotor back on. This side's gonna be pretty much done. So I'm gonna get this put together. If you have any questions, definitely put them in the comments. But I think this is pretty self-explanatory. So let me get this together. I'm gonna go ahead and finish the other side as well. And then we're gonna move to the rear and do the rear shocks. Luckily, rear shocks are a total breeze on both the Chevy Cruze and the Volt here. There are just three pieces of hardware that you need to remove. We've got a main bolt down here on the bottom, all by itself right there. That's gonna be an 18. And then up here on the top, we've got two 13mm bolts that are shrouded by this cover right here. So luckily, you don't actually need to remove the shroud. You can just kind of finagle an extension up in there and remove those bolts. So I'll go ahead and show that to you now. I'm gonna start with the two on the top, and then we'll do the bottom one. All right, so the hardware that we're after is just on either side of this shroud right here. Not too big of a deal to get to. If you really wanted to, you could remove the inner fender linings, but I think it's more hassle than it's worth. You really don't gain anything by getting to that. So what I'm doing is I'm using a little bit of a wobble extension here on the end, and that should be all that you've got to do. You may or may not be able to fit your impact in there. This is a lot easier than some vehicle rear struts where you have to go removing all kinds of interior pieces to get to the hardware that bolts in from the top. Really glad we don't have to worry about that in this case. These things are not very tight at all. Okay, we got our second one out. Let's see if we can get it out. Now, pushing it. Okay, we're gonna push up a little bit just to compress the shock, and then we can pull it down. Hey, there's our other stuck piece of hardware. That's great. When you pull this thing down, just go ahead and take note of the upper mounting orientation. That way you can put your new shock in the same way. All right, so this is what I mean. This upper mount here has two different directions. It's the same part number for both the left and the right side. So you want to have the flat side towards the car and the more rounded side towards the outside. We'll just take this thing out the top and stick our new one in the exact same way. I'm dropping it between the brake line right there, and then we'll push it back behind the liner, and then we can go straight up with it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go back down to the bottom, and we'll get the bottom in place first. Again, we're just going to compress it a tiny bit, drop it down in place. Tighten this one down. All right, so right up inside here, we're looking straight up from the bottom. You can see the rearmost mount. Really, honestly, you can just kind of finagle this thing in there. If your rear axle is drooping a little bit like mine, you may have to put a jack underneath it and raise it up. I'm gonna see right now if the hardware is long enough to engage any threads. Okay, I did have to jack up the axle just a little bit. We didn't have quite enough threads at full droop. We'll get one started before we tighten anything. I'm going to do the back side now that you can't see on the camera. And I'll go ahead and fully tighten this one that I'm starting right now. And then I'll come back and fully tighten the one that you can see. Okay, new shock is in here on the driver's side. All I've got to do is finish the passenger side, and that's going to do it for this car. We just got to go and get an alignment. It'll be the first alignment this car has had since it was brand new. It just hit 100,000 miles, so even if we didn't throw the alignment off from doing the struts up front, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and get it rechecked. So that's our next step. Well, that's going to sum up replacing the shocks, struts, and wheel bearings on your Chevy Volt or Chevy Cruze. Sorry the lighting wasn't super great, but having to work here in the garage, you know, it was what it was. Hopefully you found this video informative. If you have any questions, put them in the comments, and I'll have links in the description, or at least part numbers for what we used today, as well as torque specs for everything. Thanks for watching.